Okay guys, so in this video we're going to cover solving absolute value equations. So before we do that, I want to remind you what an absolute value is. So an absolute value it gives or it represents a number's distance from zero. So essentially, we use absolute value to measure distance. So for example, when I take the absolute value of -5, I'm really asking how far is -5 from 0? Well, if here's -5 and here's 0, -5 is 5 units from 0. So the absolute value is +5. And so that's why you learn that absolute values are always equal to a positive number. And just a quick pun for you. What do you call a pile of cats? A meowton. That wasn't even remotely funny. So when we have an equation with x where it says the absolute value of x equals 4, what we're really saying is what numbers are 4 units from 0. And so, of course, we know +4 is 4 units away from 0, but we also know that -4 is 4 units from 0. So we know that x could be +4 or x could be -4. Both answers work for x. If I were to plug in 4 for x, the absolute value of 4 is 4, or if I were to plug in -4 for x in the original equation, the absolute value of -4 is also 4. So when we're given problems like the absolute value of x minus 3 equals 8, we have two possibilities. The number inside the absolute value can either be equal to +8. If the thing inside the absolute value is equal to +8, the absolute value of +8 is 8, or the thing inside the absolute value could be equal to -8. Because the thing inside the absolute value, if it's equal to -8, then we are going to take the absolute value of -8, which is 8. So I solve each of these separately, and I get from the first equation that x could be 11, and I get from the second equation that x could be -5. So x is either 11 or -5. We want to get into the habit of checking these, because eventually we'll have some equations where the answers won't work if we plug it back in. So if I plug in 11, I get 11 minus 3. The absolute value of it equals 8. The absolute value of 11 minus 3, well, 11 minus 3 is 8, and we see that the absolute value of 8 is in fact 8. So that checks out. If we plug in -5, -5 minus 3 is -8, which when we take the absolute value of -8, we do get 8 as well. So absolute value equations will always have two answers. So with an equation like this one, 3 times the absolute value of 2x minus 7 minus 5 equals 4, we want to get the absolute value alone before we make our two equations. So it's so important that we get the absolute value sign alone first. So to do that, I need to get rid of the -5 and I need to get rid of the times 3. So I'm going to work away from the absolute value. So what's furthest away from the absolute value is the -5. So I'm going to add the 5 to both sides. That's going to give me 3 times the absolute value of 2x minus 7 is equal to 9. And I still need to get rid of this times 3 in front of the absolute value. So to do that, I'm going to divide both sides by 3. And that gives me the absolute value of 2x minus 7 equals 3. Now that I have the absolute value alone, I can make my two equations. I know that I want the thing inside the absolute value to either be positive 3, or it could be negative 3, because when I take the absolute value of negative 3, I'm going to get positive 3 as well. So by solving this one, I get 2x equals 10, which gives me x equals 5. And solving the other equation, I get 2x equals 4, which means x equals 2. So x could either be 5 or 2, which I also want to make sure I get in the habit of checking. So if I plug in 5 to the original equation, I get 3 times the absolute value of 2 times 5 minus 7 minus 5 equals 4. So inside the absolute value, I get 10 minus 7, which is 3. I know the absolute value of 3 is 3. So I get 9 minus 5 equals 4, which is true. Then I'm going to plug in 2 to give me 3 times the absolute value of 2 times 2 minus 7 minus 5 equals 4. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 minus 7 is going to be negative 3, but when I take the absolute value of negative 3, I get positive 3. So I get 3 times 3 minus 5 equals 4, which I know will work out. So I want you now to try this one on your paper. I want you to pause the video, and when you're done, unpause the video to see the correct solution. All right, so check your work. You should have gotten t equals negative 3 or t equals negative 15. Remember, before I can make my two equations, I have to get the absolute value sign alone. So that's what I was doing in these steps here. Okay, so some equations, just like regular equations, some absolute value equations have no solutions. No solutions happen when an absolute value equals a negative. Absolute values cannot be equal to a negative. However, the value of x can be negative. So like in our last problem, we found that x equals negative 3 or x equals negative 15. That was totally fine because when I plugged in those numbers, it became the absolute value of them. So that was allowed. What is not allowed is if I have the absolute value of x plus 5 equal to negative 7. There's no number that I could plug in for x to give me negative 7, because when I take the absolute value of any number, it's always going to be a positive. It'll never be a negative. So this is not possible.